every Indian's mind. How do we tame this unruly beast to our east? No, I don't mean to make light of this cliched remark, however poetic it may sound. The recent events have indicated that the salami slicing of Indian territory over the years has been played out with the finesse of a master chef, where the Chinese have taken 2 steps forward and retreated 1 step, only if push came to shove. In case we did not notice, the grab was larger. In any case, they have seldom stepped back 2 steps and have consolidated the 1 step they gained at points of their choosing and at times of their choosing over the vast 3,488 kilometers long border. The South China Sea is another region that says it all. The world was a mute spectator to the entire island grab that took place there in defiance of international conventions like the UNCLOS. So how have the Chinese been so adept at the concept of land grabbing, salami slicing, or creeping invasion? Call it what you will. The genesis of the land grab mentality lies in the nurtured by the 2,500 years old Chinese game Go, which, unlike the Indian invention of chess, where the ultimate aim is to capture the opponent's king, aims at capturing maximum territory on the board. To now put the concept of Go into practice, therefore, comes naturally to the Chinese mind. The digital strong innovation team from Australia, I'm sure Rory knows about it, has recently stated that the PLAF was involved in a sand model discussion on exactly the scenario that emerged on 15 June. Only that the exact replica of the area of operations was 2,500 kilometers to the east of Galwan. Also, the sand model discussion took place almost a decade ago. It just goes to show that the buildup of forces and infrastructure in the Galwan Valley was premeditated. Also, the brutal means used to kill and maim Indian soldiers was done by forces not the usual ones that the Indian troops recognized. The PLA is known to have also carried out exercises to capture airfields and passes at high altitudes with special forces during the Stride series of exercises along with the PLAF for the last 1 decade. Capturing passes? One does not need to capture passes and airfields at high altitudes in a Taiwan contingency. The practices were obviously aimed at a future confrontation with India. Of greater significance is the 8th edition of the Shaheen series of exercises between PAF and the PLAF that were held in the region adjoining Ladakh. This was as involved an exercise as one can imagine, complete with dissimilar air combat training, AVACs, special forces, red versus blue large force engagements et al. The only difference was that it was held in the likely area of operations for a future conflict where a 2-front dilemma could have been posed to India. That the practice scenario was almost became a reality is a chilling reminder about the designs that our adversaries harbor against the Indian state, triggered into overdrive possibly by the declarations of 5th August 2019. It was only due to the alacrity of the Indian Army and the timely forward deployment of the IAF that any serious developments were avoided. Of course, diplomacy played an important part in diffusing the situation. Apart from the military option, does India have any other options to forestall such a situation from happening again? Are there any leverages that can be applied against China? What would be the role of the friendships? That have been cultivated over the years in the form of the quadrilateral security dialogue, or simply Quad, peace and tranquility along our northern borders? We have an extremely distinguished panel that would discuss exploring India's leverages against China: economic, Tibet, Taiwan, and the Indo-Pacific. Our first speaker is Dr. Sanjay Baru, to discuss economic leverages available to India to cause discomfort to China that is already struggling with a faltering economy due to the virtual stoppage of its flagship project, the BRI, in the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic. With the recent announcement by the Government of India that any country that shares a land border with India can no longer avail of the automatic route in FDI, but must seek government clearance over any investment proposal, China is sure to feel the heat. Its FDI investments in India stood at 1.8 billion US dollars from 2015 to 2019. This policy of the Government of India is aimed at blocking the opportunist takeover of Indian companies, mainly startups, by venture capitalists from China that are normally backed by the state. A word about Dr. Baru. He has been the Director for Geoeconomics and Strategy at the International Institute of Strategic Studies, London, a member of India's National Security Advisory Board from 1998 to 2001, has been the Associate Editor of the Economic Times and the Times of India, a distinguished fellow at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, and the USI. Most importantly, he is a founder-trustee of the Forum for National Security Studies, the parent organization for CAPS. So you have 12 to 15 minutes, all yours.
Sir, may I just interject for all participants? Your questions have to be put in the chat box. Please type your name, your question, and to whom it is addressed to. At the end of all the panelists when they finish speaking, I will be taking on the Q&A and addressing your questions to the panelists. Dr. Baru, sorry for interjecting. All yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Air Marshal, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion. The subject given to me is to explore what are the economic leverages India might have in dealing with the kind of pressure that China is exerting along the border in the current context. Well, in the 10-12 minutes I have, I'll make 9 points. So let me go one by one. First of all, I think it's important to recognize that you can have a leverage only if you have linkages. This is something which a lot of us need to understand, that leverages are a consequence or a product of linkages. If you did not have a linkage with the Chinese economy, you would not have a leverage, right? So therefore, the fact that we have built up these linkages, particularly over the last 15 years or so, now gives us the leverage. And this is something we should recognize not just in the context of our relations with China, but even in the context of our relations with Pakistan and all our neighbors and all other countries, that economic relations can be both beneficial, but they can also be strategic and offer us opportunities for either working together or for taking actions that may hurt the other party. And that has been the case with economic relations right through history. The second proposition is, and this is very important to recognize, that if you have linkages, you create interdependencies. But well, let me first say you create dependencies. But whether we look at dependencies unidirectionally or in bilateral terms is the name of the game. For a long time, particularly after independence, the thinking in this country was that international economic relations create dependencies, and therefore we try to reduce those dependencies. Our strategy of import substituting industrialization, not allowing foreign investment into India, not encouraging international trade. This isolationist economic policy that we undertook between 1947 and 1991 was based on the assumption that dependency creates a problem. After 1991, we have been working on the basis of the assumption that while dependencies may create problems, interdependencies create opportunities. And that is how we have become a more open economy. We have been more open to trade. We have been more open to investment. And it's the same pattern followed by many other countries. The United States and China too followed the same strategy of creating interdependencies. And interdependencies offer leverages. So when you are dependent on the Chinese economy, China has a leverage against you. When China is dependent on me, I have a leverage against China. I emphasize this because right now in India, there is a school of opinion going around that we should be much more insular and more protectionist. We have in fact actually increased tariffs over the last 3-4 years. The Prime Minister has recently clarified, addressing an international conference, he has clarified that his strategy of Atmanirbharta doesn't mean insulation, doesn't mean inward looking, doesn't mean that we cut off ourselves from the rest of the world. In fact, we have to be open to global trade flows, etc. So I'm mentioning this because there is a larger context within which we have to see our relations with China. My third proposition is that in the literature on international relations, there has been this proposition that economic relations have the benefit of creating a stake in peace, that countries that trade with each other do not go to war with each other. This has been a standard, an argument that if you go back to the literature in the 1980s, 90s, etc., and that was the basis on which the United States admitted China into the World Trade Organization, normalized economic relations with China, allowed China to emerge as a major trading power. Because the assumption was, if you have strong economic relations, trade relations, then the chances of conflict get reduced. The other side cannot go to war because, in fact, they have an economic stake. I think what the current situation tells us is that that is no longer true. That certainly, whatever the benefits there are limited. That when a country decides to, for whatever reasons, political, military, geopolitical, whatever the reasons, decides to turn an adversary, it is willing to pay the economic cost. For example, we take India-Pakistan relations. Pakistan has never given India the most friendly, most favored nation treaty status under the WTO. Though this hurts Pakistan because Pakistan could benefit hugely by trading with India, and yet it chooses not to for political reasons. So therefore, you have to recognize that while economic linkages offer leverages and a greater level of interdependence between countries can encourage or create a stake for peace, that when a country takes a political decision that is not going to pursue peace for the sake of peace, that it has other goals, then these arguments fall by the wayside. And I think we are now at that turning point in our relations with China. I have been a strong advocate of stronger economic relations with China over the last 15, 20 years. I have been an advocate of increased Chinese investment into India, increased trade with China, etc. Even the argument that we suffer a huge trade deficit vis-a-vis China, which has been a major complaint by India, successive governments, both the Manmohan Singh government and the Modi government. I used to take the view that while one should demand a reduced trade deficit, while one should demand fair trade, while one should target non-tariff barriers that the Chinese have erected, the fact is that India has a trade surplus with most of its neighbors. India has a trade surplus with Bangladesh, for example, and Bangladesh has consistently, complained that that they suffer a trade deficit vis-a-vis India. So there is a structural issue that larger economies tend to export more, to smaller economies tend to export less. India was not as export-oriented as China was, and therefore the trade deficit has structural factors. And the Chinese have argued this. I've been in seminars with Chinese where they have said this, and it was a fair argument. But when you cross a certain threshold in the relationship, and currently I believe we are in the situation where the Chinese have crossed a threshold. They have taken steps which have hurt at the foundations of trust between our two countries. I've seen this relationship of trust develop right through the post-Deng era under the leadership of people like Wen Jiabao and Hu Jintao. But under Xi Jinping, there is a reversal. So the Chinese have consciously taken a political decision to basically to exert pressure, not just on India, on a lot of its neighbors, on Australia, on Japan, on Vietnam, on Indonesia, on the Philippines. And therefore, there is a concern about Chinese assertiveness, expansionism, imperialism, hegemonism. Different words are used. But basically, the entire Chinese neighborhood, with probably the exception of North Korea and Pakistan, are deeply concerned with Chinese behavior. And therefore, the economic leverages are to that extent less and less important. India has to be willing to pay an economic price if it wants to, take on this Chinese assertiveness. This is my third proposition. Third proposition. My fourth proposition is that there are, whatever the extent of our linkages, history tells us that there are limits to what economic sanctions can do if a nation decides that it is willing to pay an economic price. There are several examples. There's the example of India. The United States, for example, subjected us to economic sanctions because we are not signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We withstood all those sanctions. We were targets of a technology denial regime on the part of the United States. We withstood that. We did not give up our nuclear program because the United States was using economic leverages to hurt us. The United States has done this with many other countries. Like Iran is an example. Iran has been a target of US economic sanctions, but Iranian policy has not substantially changed in response to these economic sanctions. So I don't expect Chinese behavior to change as a result of whatever economic measures we take. We have a leverage because we have the linkage. So my first point, linkages have created leverage, but even if that leverage is used, it is unlikely to alter Chinese behavior. There is an excellent study done at the Peterson Institute in Washington, D.C. around 2000. I think it was led by Fred Bergston, which was a survey of all economic sanctions from 1945 to 2000, to 1995, a 50-year survey. And it showed that the only example of successful economic sanctions was apartheid, where almost the entire world was on the same side and sanctioned South Africa against apartheid. There are very few other examples of bilateral sanctions altering behavior. So while India has taken certain steps, and I'll come to those, I think there was no option but take those steps. I don't think the literature on sanctions tells us that it is likely to alter Chinese behavior. So that's my fourth proposition. Fifth, let me get into the nitty-gritty of our trade relationship. The fact is that everybody says, in China is one of our major trade partners. It used to be largest trade partner at some point till recently. It has slid down the scale. UAE has become a major trade partner. I think now UAE has also slid down the scale. US is re-emerging as a major trade partner. But the fact is that China is not an important export market for India. So when we talk about sanctions, when we talk about denying the Chinese access to our market, we need not worry about the consequences of the Chinese retaliating, because India's exports to China are not that high. If you look at the structure of trade, the latest data that we have, the US today accounts for 19% of Indian exports. The European Union accounts for 17% of Indian exports. ASEAN countries account for 10% of Indian exports. So US, EU, and ASEAN are the top three trading partners for India. Africa comes next with 9% of our total exports. China is way below with 5.5%. Of course, if you add Hong Kong to China, which in many ways one should, because a lot of trade coming out of Hong Kong is actually Chinese trade, the total share of China and Hong Kong together is about 5.5 to 3. About 9%. So China and Africa are at the same level. So as an export market, China is not such an important export market for India. I mean, it is important, but point is, it's not the United States, it's not the European Union, it's not even the ASEAN. But from the import point of view, China has been important. That is precisely why we have a trade deficit. There again, our dependence is critical only in two sectors, in telecom and IT hardware and active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs. And in both cases, our dependence on China is a product of our own policies. API particularly, we were quite strong on APIs, but our pharmaceutical industry chose to go up the scale in terms of the products it was producing, branded generics, etc. And we started importing APIs. The Chinese have a scale advantage, and therefore we're exporting APIs. India can make the transition, develop a domestic API industry, but that will take time. Until that happens, our dependence on Chinese API imports will remain. And these are important not because of our own domestic market, but because actually in pharmaceuticals, we are a major exporting power. And we export to United States, we export to European Union. So this has been an important part of our global exports. And to retain our share of world exports, we need to be importing APIs. If we reduce our share of world exports, it is China that will benefit. It will enter the markets that Indian exporters vacate. So our concern is really in 2 or 3 critical areas, and I think our government has recognized that, and there is targeted policy, sectoral policy happening. But on a larger level, I think the initiative taken by the government, particularly by political parties, the campaign for what is called vocal for local, boycott of Chinese goods, that has triggered a sentiment which was not there even 2-3 years ago. I remember when I was FICCI a couple of years back, the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Finance asked us to present a report on Chinese, the impact of Chinese imports on Indian industry, and Indian industry was very concerned. But the problem Indian industry faced, I can tell you, was that a lot of the consumers were opting for Chinese imports rather than buying Indian products. One of the reasons why Government of India raised tariffs in the last 3-4 years was precisely for this reason. That if I were, let us say, a car manufacturer and I had to buy tires, why should I buy tires from an Indian company which is more expensive when I can import tires from China? And that was what was happening. So across the board, a lot of Indian companies were importing not just finished goods, but even intermediate goods because the Chinese were supplying cheaper. And while it is true that the Chinese policies have been extremely non-transparent, which is why many countries, including India, do not grant China the market economy status in the WTO. The fact also is that one of the major reasons why the Chinese products are able to compete is because of economies of scale. We have suffered as a result of adequate scale. Whatever the Chinese produce, they produce on a large scale, and therefore they are able to cut unit costs. And of course, the labor productivity is much higher.
Interject, sir. If you can kindly
wind up.
Okay. Wind up.
Let me quickly go through. So I think the sentiment in this country is changing. So rather than any governmental action, consumer action, in fact, is going to have a major impact on reducing demand for Chinese goods. Finally, let me very quickly make 2 additional points. The one is in the area of technology. I think the fact that we have banned certain apps and softwares, and we are now most likely not to allow Huawei to come into 5G trials, etc. This entire regime of technology denial, which we are putting in place, will have a huge impact. It will have a huge impact not just in India, because India is not such a big customer for China, but it is having an impact across the world. Around the world, you see more and more countries are now questioning the participation of China in 5G trials, questioning the use of Chinese software. In the United States, yesterday, TikTok came up for examination. The UK has decided to ban Huawei and 5G, etc. So there's a global sentiment, just as there's a domestic consumer sentiment that is going to hurt China much more than any official policy. I think across the world also there's a global sentiment, consumer sentiment, which is going to force governments to take action. And the Chinese have to be concerned about this because their entire industry is an export-oriented industry. Unlike India, for example, and United States. United States and India do not run an export-oriented economy. Their focus is domestic markets. China runs an export-oriented economy and therefore must worry about international consumption attitudes. Finally, let me make a very simple point, which is in a sense a link between India's economic policy and its geopolitics. Which is, I've always been a critic of this government's decision to walk out of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, the RCEP. We have somehow portrayed RCEP purely as a Chinese game. The fact is the RCEP is an Asian game. The because Chinese dominate Asia, and therefore they are the biggest players. But I have not understood why we have conceded space, so willingly to China by simply walking out of RCEP. The Japanese, ASEAN, Singapore, all of them are asking India to return to the RCEP table because that is the Asian market in the making, and China is naturally going to be a major player. But I think our strategy has to be one of retaining linkages. I come back to my original point that if you want to use leverage, you have to have linkage. Unless you have a stake in the system, you cannot influence the system. And we have to be back on the table negotiating an RCEP, whatever our strength is, be participating in that and build alliances with Japan, with Korea, with Indonesia, with Singapore, with Australia, with New Zealand, with Taiwan, with all these countries, build relationships that leverage our influence in these negotiations. So I'll end by saying that in order to be able to have use economic policy as a leverage, we need to actually retain these linkages rather than retreat from those linkages. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baro. And I think you, at the cost of repetition, the important points that you made. Interdependencies offer leverages, which will be very significant. And China willing to bear the cost if it decides to go to war, and that's exactly what it has done. Only one question that remains is that China has crossed the threshold of trust. Has it crossed the threshold? Means is this absolutely irreversible, or it can be reversed in the future? We can discuss that during the question hour. Okay, that's just a point from my side. And China's economy is stuttering and it's falling, and because of the world pushback, not only for the BRI, but also for the Huawei and the 5G. And your final point about China, we have to retain linkages. I think that's a very significant takeaway, that if you want to have leverages, then you have to retain linkages. And walking out of RCP was not to be seen in that particular light. Thank you very much, Dr. Baro. We now move to a neighboring country, a neighboring state. With the recent introduction of a bill by a member of the United States House of Representatives for recognizing the Tibet Autonomous Region as an independent country, the Chinese must have got somewhat rattled. Of course, there is still a long way to go before the bill passes both the House of Representatives and the Senate before the President signs it into law. And we will hear more about the fault lines that exist within Tibet that could be exploited by India from Shri Jayadeva Ranade, our next speaker. He has been a China watcher and is presently the president of the recently established Center for China Analysis and Strategy. He's also a member of the core group on China at the Indian Council of World Affairs. And most importantly, he is a distinguished fellow at the Center for Air Power Studies. Good to have you with us, Jayadeva. All yours.
Thank you, Marshal Nohwar, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, as always. You've given me a topic which is a mixture of hard-nosed practical application as well as a bit esoteric thinking, out-of-the-box thinking. Let me try to tackle it, which is be a leverage for us. Yes. Since 2010, China has made it very clear that issues of sovereignty and territory will trump trade. And they applied this in a fairly punitive manner on the Philippines and later on Japan when they stopped the supply of rare earths. With the advent of Xi Jinping, he has announced what are called the 2 centenaries goals, which is the China Dream by 2021, which includes the recovery of territories lost through the imposition of unequal treaties by foreign powers, which is what we are seeing across our border today, and the ambition to make China a major power with global pioneering influence. In other words, to rival the United States or surpass it, including in the ability to create new international organizations or influence the ones which already exist. That is by 2049. So he has set the benchmark very clearly as to where he wants to be. And this will make engaging China, this will make moderating China's behavior, in my view, more difficult and increasingly more difficult with the passage of time. But this will also afford greater traction to the views of people who look at China in a clear-eyed, realistic fashion. I include myself in one of them. And the rise in global anti-China sentiment will assist the process. Let me now get down to Tibet and give you a brief background as to the area that we are looking at. It is, of course, firstly, there has been a massive slicing of the original size of Tibet from 2.5 million square kilometers to 1.2 million square kilometers, which has caused its own resentment among the Tibetan people. The second has been the persistent effort since 1950, when the Chinese, as they put it, peacefully liberated Tibet, the Chinese army. And since then, they have tried to undermine and undercut not only the Tibetan religion, but also Tibetan language, customs, and practices, thereby triggering greater resentment among the people. Notwithstanding all this, there has been a reversal of policy in the late 70s, when they again allowed, after the Cultural Revolution, some of the monasteries to be rebuilt, some of the monks to come back to work. But with the exponential growth in Buddhism around the world, and especially in China, where their numbers are today estimated to be between 200 and 300 million, the Chinese Communist Party has also got nervous. Mind you, they continue to say, for example, in troubled provinces like Xinjiang and Ningxia, that people would be better off switching to Buddhism rather than continuing to be adherents of Islam, because Buddhism, they consider, is a more peaceful religion and an ancient, as they put it, ancient Chinese religion. But notwithstanding that, the Chinese Communist Party has got nervous now at the growth in the number of Buddhist followers, and therefore they have started applying restrictions on the movement of monks and the teachings that they impart in various parts of China. That, to my mind, is a fault line that we can look at and we can exploit. The monks particularly exercise tremendous influence in Tibet and among Tibetans, and they are quite unhappy at the manner in which they're being treated and regimented. They've been constituted into cadres, even within the monasteries. The other factor are the living Buddhas. Now, China designated about 784 living Buddhas. They compiled a roster and legitimizing these living Buddhas, and said that only those who have been approved by Beijing will actually be designated as such and have all the benefits. They have subsequently set up schools where the living Buddhas go and graduate from. So the last bunch, the first group actually, of 6 living Buddhas graduated just a few days ago after 3 years of political education, and according to the official readouts, they have now emerged as good citizens of China. They will now start their religious studies. So they are tackling this at the grassroots level. But on the one hand, while they're doing this, on the other, they're generating greater resentment among the Tibetan people. The third factor are just to indicate the resilience of the Tibetan and his firm belief in his practice. practices in customs is effort by the Chinese Communist Party to try and maximize the number of members in the Chinese Communist Party, number of Tibetans who joined the Chinese Communist Party. They have not been very successful. Over the last few years, particularly since 2014, where they had 225,000 odd Tibetans in the Chinese Communist Party, this week they announced that they now have 398,000, which is about 80,000 more, which is quite a meager advance if one looks at it, considering their ambition was to have one party member in each family among the Tibetans. These steps, additional steps that we need to take, or the additional fault lines, and each one of these are areas that I suggest are worth tapping into, worth exploiting through various means. As far as the resentment among Tibetans is concerned, it can be done through two methods. One is through religious instruction or instructors going there. Second is through broadcasts. I'll come to that later. And the other fault line that is looming large today is that of the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. This has the Chinese extremely worried. The Dalai Lama has already put in place certain institutions. He has created this administration in exile. But apart from that, he has set up over the years the International Campaign for Tibet and the Tibet Information Network. These are two bodies which will continue later also. And they do have the ability to galvanize Tibet supporters across the world. The Dalai Lama has also been able to enhance, to a very large extent, awareness about the problems and difficulties of Tibetans and the manner in which they're being treated inside Tibet. The restrictions on them have been noted, including by the United States, and they're already taking steps to tackle them. As far as India is concerned, one area that we need to step up activity on, which has not been done, is the area of broadcasts. There is a ready market for broadcasts from Indian soil beamed into Tibet, which can carry a mixture of not only religious instruction, but political messages. This needs to be done. It has been done with great success by the PMO and ISA. Similarly, the border defense villages that China has set up, and whose number is planned 700, will be targeted by these broadcasts, and hopefully we will succeed in weakening the so-called patriotic resolve, as the Chinese put it, of the inhabitants of these areas. The next point would be that Tibet being considered a water tower of the world, and which is the source of all the major rivers in this area, including our Indo-Gangetic belt, the Satluj, the Indus, etc., we need to now form a consortium of countries, the lower riparian countries, to make this an issue. The diversion of the Brahmaputra is one. The Mekong River issue is the second. But if a consortium is formed and raised, it will add to the pressure on China and try and get it to moderate its behavior. The other point is the manner in which China continues to push or advance its claims, either through restricting the visas being given to people to visit China and or Tibet, and by designating countries or areas as disputed and telling the concerned international bodies not to provide any assistance for projects in those areas. In fact, in some cases, the maps also, they insist, show those areas as either disputed or Chinese territory. The other areas are raising the issue of the harassment of the Tibetans, of the restrictions on Tibetans at international fora. This needs to be done. We have avoided doing it so far, but I think after what China has done now, the lines that have been crossed, I think India should take these matters up quite openly and at the international fora. I am not getting into identifying infrastructure projects inside Tibet as potential targets. That is something that the armed forces will do, and that's quite obvious. I am just trying to list areas where we can step up activity. And finally, let me just say, one of them is to try once again for leadership, to get the leadership of the Buddhist movement as such. We have the Dalai Lama with us, he's alive, and we need to stop thinking in terms of small little efforts like a painting program somewhere or a dance program somewhere, but look at a broader perspective in which we will be welcomed, as past experience has shown, and try and get the world Buddhist movement as such into its own, into assuming an pan-Buddhist identity of its own, so that the Chinese efforts are negated. This will pave the way for the Dalai Lama also to be reincarnated wherever he wants, but it will give us the edge that we need over a religious movement that spans many countries. So I'll stop here. These are areas that can be done. These are initiatives that India can take, and I think we can take it with less risk than some others. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much, Emma.
Thank you, Jayadeva. Always very incisive and to the point. When you were talking about broadcasts from Indian soil to be beamed to Tibet, just at that time, there was some interference caused to whatever you were trying to say. So was it deliberate or was it a coincidence? I'm not sure. Otherwise,
I knew that wasn't you, and I assumed that the Chinese had intercepted your conference.
So anyway, so we'll move on now, and we have the next speaker from carrying out a fellowship at Taiwan. And as far as the Republic of China Air Force is concerned, it has one of the most unenviable tasks that could be thrust on the shoulders of any Air Force. That is to protect the homeland from invasion by a giant from across the straits. That Taiwan has managed this task commendably till the 1990s is no mean achievement. It has now, of course, been swamped by the sheer magnitude of the threat which it is up against, both numerically and technologically. Even the US State Department's recent decision to approve Taiwan's request for recertification of the PSC-3 Patriot missiles, which were purchased from the US years ago, is no solace for the island state. Yet, Taiwan remains the only country to fully understand the Han psyche, and in turn, the likely fault lines that could be exploited. Our next speaker, Ms. Sana Hashmi, is singularly privileged to offer this audience a ringside view of the complexities that the leadership of China faces today, particularly the internal fault lines that can be exploited. This is because she is presently a Taiwan Fellow at the Institute for International Relations, Chengchi University. She has been a former consultant with the MEA, India, and most importantly, she was a former associate fellow at CAPS. And all yours, next 15 minutes.
Thank you, sir, for that kind introduction, and thank you for having me here in this webinar. It's always good to come back to CAPS. So about the question of Taiwan, so what we have seen is amid this recent violent standoff between India and China, we have been witnessing how there have been calls to advance ties with Taiwan. We are seeing that there's this unprecedented enthusiasm about Taiwan in India. But despite these developments, if you look at the scale of cooperation or depth on India-Taiwan relationship, we realize that it is clearly underutilized, and it is nothing when we compare it with Taiwan's relationship with other Asian countries. Till the time Kuomintang was in power, there was mutual neglect, there was lack of ambition. But now we have Democratic People's Party, and since the time Tsai Ing-wen come to power, we have seen that there is this renewed interest in engaging India. Taiwan is looking towards the South Asian region with India at the core of its new southbound policy. So this new southbound policy holds immense relevance for Taiwan. It aims to strengthen cooperation and strengthen ties in the Indo-Pacific region with the countries in the region. It already has robust ties with the United States. Its ties with Japan are also on track, but there is a need to reinforce ties with countries which are now a part of the new southbound policy. So it is actually unprecedented that Taiwan has a policy for countries in the South Asian region, and now 5 South Asian countries are a part of this policy. So this is also important when Taiwan does not have diplomatic ties with any of these countries, especially India. So now there have been questions about whether Act East policy complements the new southbound policy, or whether after the Galwan deadlock is over, will India be more forthcoming towards Taiwan? I believe that there exists a mechanism to carry these issues forward. But from India's side, I see no proactive approach. Even though the Act East policy was introduced, despite being an important part of the region, Taiwan was officially not a part of it. It briefly figured out in the 1990s when the Lowy's policy was introduced. It was the time when the quasi-embassy of Taiwan, the Taiwan Economic and Cultural Center, was established in New Delhi. So the relationship, I believe, still remain underutilized despite all those developments, and India still remains cautious. It's not that India is not aware about the potential of engaging Taiwan. India very well knows about how it is important to engage Taiwan. But I believe that there are 2 constraints we need to talk about when we talk about advancing ties with Taiwan. So the first constraint is, of course, India's strict adherence to One China policy. So India was the second non-communist country to recognize the People's Republic of China, and also to show adherence to One China policy. But we know that since 2010, India has not been mentioning One China policy in its joint statement and its official documents. Even if we recall, in 2014, then External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj asked China to respect India's One India policy if it wants India to reciprocate and respect One China policy. So there was clearly some rethinking on One China policy when Modi came to power. He took a few bold steps. One of the most important developments was to invite Ambassador Chung Kwang-Thian, the former representative of TCC. He is now going to be the Vice Foreign Minister of MOFA in Taiwan. And also he invited Dr. Lobsang Sangay, the President of Central Tibetan Administration, Tibetan government in exile, to a swearing-in ceremony in 2014. But in reality, if we see, India still practices One China policy. And India has been cautious in expanding political and even economic ties with Taiwan. So all these moves have symbolic relevance if these are not followed by concrete actions. This is what happens with India and Taiwan. And in fact, momentum began to slow down around 2016 when China began to oppose the increasing interaction between Taiwan and India, especially the visit of an all-women parliamentary delegation from Taiwan to India in 2016. So I believe that this scope of cooperation and interaction have remained extremely limited. There's no effort from the official side to communicate effectively. So this is why I believe that there's a need for a comprehensive approach. The whole of government approach needs to be there. So coming to the second constraint, I believe that though a lot of scholars have been saying that this is an opportunity, this is not a constraint, but I think from India's perspective, it is going to be a constraint. This is the protracted border dispute. It's not an opportunity for India to engage Taiwan. So from India's perspective, not resolving the dispute is kind of China's way of keeping India preoccupied. I believe that it's not about the territory. It's more about keeping India preoccupied with something which is as huge as a long-standing border dispute. So this has been going on for the past 7 decades, and it is in China's interest to keep the dispute alive with India. And in fact, by keeping the dispute alive, China is not losing much. But having an a disputed, undemarcated border with a country as assertive and aggressive as China acts as a pressure point for India. And if at all India decides to advance ties with Taiwan, it is aware that the more India engages Taiwan, the more backlash it is going to receive from the Chinese side. Friendship and cooperation with Taiwan means perpetual animosity with China. So this will also mean China getting more assertive on the border front. So I guess this is one risk that India does not want to take at the moment. And also, I really do not subscribe to this idea that Taiwan could be used as a card against China. Taiwan has its own merit. And if we keep racking up the issue of Taiwan whenever we have a problem with China, I believe the utility of Taiwan will only be unidimensional. And once the relationship gets normalized with China, Taiwan will be neglected again. And as a scholar of China's foreign policy, Taiwan foreign policy, I strongly believe we really need to get over this ad hocism, which we practice when it comes to Taiwan. So the question is India ready to advance ties with Taiwan? Is India ready to do something like this? In my opinion, considering the current state of relationship, it will not be immediately possible to bring ties to an advanced level. It will take a sustained interest and attention from the Indian government to rack up ties with Taiwan. So what can we do in such a situation? I believe that it's a far-fetched conclusion to even say that we can have robust defense ties with Taiwan. I guess what we really need to start with is basics here. Even the basics are not in place right now when it comes to India-Taiwan relationship. And I believe to have basics in place, what we need to do is to have greater people-to-people contacts between India and Taiwan. And I believe that the number of academic interactions need to be there, which have remained low till now. And in fact, most of the initiatives are led by Taiwan. So there have been a few exchanges between the two sides, and one is, of course, invitation to IDSA's Asian Security Conference. In fact, I met someone 2 days ago. He is a faculty at National Defense University, and he said that he has been to CAPS thrice. So I think there have been exchanges, but these exchanges are limited number when we compare it with what we have with China. Also, there was a striking conversation I had with one of the scholars, and he said that we know China in and out. And if India wants to understand China, it is important that India comes to us. We need to have more academic exchanges with India. So I believe a case needs to be built for greater people-to-people exchanges, as well as greater institutional cooperation between think tanks and universities. The second recommendation I have is that it's very important, especially for India, to focus on the economic aspect of the relationship. This is one area which has a lot of potential and which has remained underutilized. So when India has made it clear that it will not be a part of the Belt and Road Initiative in its current form, I think it might be useful to look towards Taiwanese companies and encourage them to take up big ticket projects in different parts of India. And now we know that Foxconn is already investing in Apple plant in Chennai. So I believe that we really need to invite more and more Taiwanese companies to India. So now coming to the how India can play a role in positioning Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific region. Professor Medcalf is going to talk about Indo-Pacific region. So I'm just going to focus on the region vis-a-vis Taiwan, why it is important to include Taiwan and why it is important for India to advocate for a greater position for Taiwan in the region. So one very important idea is that the idea of the Indo-Pacific region is only strengthened when there are different stakeholders. And then if Taiwan becomes an important part of the Indo-Pacific region, the idea of the Indo-Pacific region is only going to be strengthened. It's not because the Indo-Pacific region is perceived to be something which is drawn against China, but the fact that the Indo-Pacific believes in open, rule-based, inclusive regional order, I believe this is very important. So I believe that the rule-based Indo-Pacific order should definitely include Taiwan. And the second point is that the Indo-Pacific has got to be inclusive. So this is an add-on to the first feature, which is rule-based. Seeing that the Indo-Pacific is inclusive, it also aims to include even the PRC. India's vision includes PRC and whichever country which is interested in making the region stable. So, but we have seen no enthusiasm from the PRC, then I believe that Taiwan can certainly play an important role in the region. So what we have seen is that during the COVID-19 crisis, with this limited capacity, Taiwan has projected itself as an alternative to the idea of People's Republic of China. So on the one hand, you can see one China that is authoritarian, hides information, and has been to a great extent responsible for the pandemic. But on the other hand, you have Taiwan, Republic of China, which is a democracy, has dealt with the problem fairly, systematically, transparently, and also it has been very keen on supporting other countries in the fight against the pandemic. And in fact, if you look at the list of countries Taiwan has been helping, it is not only confined to countries which are strategically and militarily important, but Taiwan has been helping several other countries as well. So I believe this is the cooperation in the age of pandemic is just not based on self-interest, but it has been inclusive. So the very idea of Indo-Pacific is inclusive, and Taiwan policy towards the region has also been inclusive. Now, the third point is that the Indo-Pacific is open. So the idea of Indo-Pacific that it is open to any country that could contribute in ensuring the stability and regional order in Asia. So I believe new realities demand that Taiwan's contribution and experience is included in the rule-based order. So Taiwan's participation would not only strengthen the idea of Indo-Pacific, it is also going to position Taiwan in the region better. But having said that, no one is looking to provoke a cross-strait conflict right now. But at the same time, it is important to include Taiwan in this mechanism so that it can stabilize the idea of the Indo-Pacific. Whether China likes it or not, Indo-Pacific is becoming a reality. It has already taken shape. So from this point of view, I believe Taiwan's participation is welcome not only for Taiwan's international stability, but also for the Indo-Pacific order. But the question here is how to achieve Taiwan's greater participation in the region. I believe to make Indo-Pacific truly inclusive, Taiwan's participation should be encouraged by countries such as India and Australia. So to conclude, I will say that Taiwan has a strong military, it has advanced economy, and I believe that if India goes for cooperation with Taiwan, it is, if I may use this phrase, it is going to be win-win cooperation for both India and Taiwan. And if India does not engage it now and continues to overlook Taiwan's potential, it will be a missed opportunity. I stop here and welcome questions.
Thank you, Sana, for your insights into how to maintain our relationship and ensure there's greater people-to-people exchange, and we should also concentrate on the economic potential of the relationship. And I think Rory possibly might cover the rules-based Indo-Pacific order that should include Taiwan as recommended by Sana. Because in her opinion, Taiwan can play a very important role in the region. With China's emergence in the region as a belligerent neighbor, exemplified actions of its Coast Guard, its maritime militia, that is the Little Blue Men, who routinely bully fishermen of the countries in the South China Sea, all claims of its peaceful rise appear to have gone down the drain. Is the Indo-Pacific likely to be the region the next war will erupt? A speaker has written a book on this very subject, titled Contest for the Pacific, Why China Won't Map the Future. Medcalf, the National Security College at the Australian National University, and the founding director of the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute, an Australian think tank of repute, based in Sydney. Let us hear from him how the leverages with arrangements like the Quad could be exploited to ensure a stable Indo-Pacific in the future. Also, are there any other leverages that can be exploited against China to keep it in its place? Over to you, Rory. You have 12 to 15 minutes for this daunting task.
Look, thank you very much. And I will just scratch the surface, I guess. And look, thanks for mentioning my book, because I think it does provide some useful material for this conversation. In fact, I think the edition that's available in India has a different title, Indo-Pacific Empire, but it's the same book with the same thesis. And I think it goes a long way to the content of our discussion. Look, I'll break my remarks into 6 short segments. Firstly, we need to just revisit briefly the real implications of what has happened in India's relations with China recently. And I think the really, violent and confronting reality check that India encountered in the Galwan bloodshed and the way that China has really treated this issue, I think that drags India through, in a more extreme way, the kind of reality check that many countries have been having on, as you say, on the nature and intent of the current regime in China, and the way, unfortunately, in which China is using the window of opportunity that the pandemic crisis has created, not as an opportunity for a renewed charm offensive or an opportunity to demonstrate peaceful rise, win-win and all that, but rather as an opportunity to try to very desperately lock in strategic gains while so much of the world is in strife. And of course, that is strife that our countries are going through precisely because the system in the People's Republic of China suppressed the truth at the start of the medical emergency back at the start of this year. So I guess it's very clear from those of us on the outside who are friends of India that the conversations that India is going through and really the policy difficulties India is going through now are very much timely. In some ways, perhaps they're overdue, but it's understandable that India had other things to focus its minds on. But most importantly, there's a convergence between the way India is responding to this new phase of China risk and the way in which I think many of our own other countries around the region and the world are having a wake-up call, a reality check. The second part of my remarks is the Indo-Pacific context to this, and I'm glad that a few speakers have mentioned this, but I'll take that forward a bit further. Why does the Indo-Pacific framework matter in assisting and shaping India's response to China risk from the recent crisis? Well, of course, we all have our own views on what the Indo-Pacific is and what it means, but I want to touch on 2 points, I think, that actually provide leverage for India, which is, of course, the purpose of our meeting here today. The first point is that the Indo-Pacific does provide an effective geographic frame of reference for India's strategic response. That is, for India protecting its interests, but from India also signalling very clearly to China that India is well positioned to complicate life for the PRC, or indeed worse, to inflict real harm on PRC interests if it comes to that. And that is, of course, that the Indo-Pacific as a two-ocean system and a region that extends really far beyond what we once thought was China's sphere of interest and influence. The Indo-Pacific is simply too large a region for China to dominate, and yet one of the very unhealthy dynamics of Chinese policy over the last 10 years or more has been an effort to extend dominance over this region. The sea lanes into the Indian Ocean, the land corridor through Pakistan, and so forth. And I think that India increasingly sees itself as part of the, I guess, the loose coalitions that can constrain China's choices in this vast space, that can permanently hold Chinese interests at risk in the Indian Ocean. And India has an opportunity to play its maritime advantage and also to exploit the sense of overstretch that China has created all the way through to Africa, to Indian Ocean states, to the Middle East, and so forth. So I do think that part of India's long-term response is going to need to be to continue strengthening its capabilities at sea, maritime surveillance, strike, and so forth, and its ability to network with a wide range of partners like Australia, and we will come to that. And that takes me to my fourth point, which is the second quality that the Indo-Pacific lends, if you like, in shaping a response for India, and that is the Indo-Pacific not as a geographic space, but as a framework for solidarity, as a basis for greater coordination and cooperation among countries with convergent interests. Most of us democracies, not all of us democracies, there's Vietnam, for example, but nonetheless a basis for solidarity that collapses some of the old geographic boundaries and political boundaries that we used to imagine that were keeping us apart. And that's why in the Indo-Pacific space, you're seeing partnerships like India and Japan, India and Australia, India, Australia and Japan, the quadrilateral dialogue, and potentially also India and Southeast Asian partners, India and European partners, and so forth. And so I think the Indo-Pacific does provide us a powerful mental map and a kind of conceptual glue for building these partnerships. And of course, the one thing of several things, one thing that does, I guess, give China pause is that idea of others achieving strength and safety in numbers and in their pushback. Now, it's very easy for me to talk about this solidarity. It's much harder for us to convert that into practical outcomes. And we have to proceed carefully and creatively here. But there are 3 layers of partnership that India is, I think, already beginning to move quite effectively to build, and which I would hope to see more of. That is strengthening these bilaterals, not only with the United States, which of course has its own problems at the moment, but particularly with Japan and with Australia and potentially with a number of other countries as well. And the Australia-India summit held recently and the new strategic, comprehensive strategic partnership gives us real practical potential to work together in areas like maritime surveillance, naval cooperation, intelligence, space, critical technologies and so forth, building some of that resilience that we're going to need in both of our countries to weather, I think, Chinese pressure. There's also the minilateral arrangements, and I do think that now is the time to move forward on the quadrilateral, not only as a dialogue, but also as a mechanism that has practical cooperation under the surface. Why can't we have quad cooperation on critical and emerging technologies? Why can't we have quad intelligence exchanges and so forth? And of course, although it's not the most important thing, but of course, I think it would be good for Australia to work with India in Malabar and other quadrilateral maritime and naval arenas. There's also the multilateral diplomatic component. And although that's really more about holding China to account and building caucuses and solidarity on the support of rules and norms, rather than achieving any immediate practical outcomes, I do think that India, as a legitimate power in the Indo-Pacific multilateral security architecture, like the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting Plus, and any other arrangements we can build below those, there's a lot that India can do and work with. And I think at the moment, there's a reservoir of not only of goodwill, but also of convergent interest for India to work with. The last couple of points I want to make, one is I just want to, which may be a little bit counterintuitive coming from me, but I also want to emphasise that the Indo-Pacific isn't everything. It isn't the be-all and end-all on building, I guess, balancing arrangements or arrangements to strengthen India in protecting its interests against China. We do need to think globally. And that's why it's fascinating to watch, particularly on technology issues and on disinformation issues, the global pushback now. The Europeans, the British and others really, this year is their wake-up year on Chinese power. And so I think there's every reason for India to reach out through those networks. I was quite impressed recently, without disclosing too much under the Chatham House rule, but I was quite impressed to join a dialogue of the so-called D10, 10 democratic countries swapping notes about how to proceed on these issues. And there was Indian participation in that conversation. I think that was really, really important. And that's why what India does at home now on the technology and geoeconomic fronts, the issues that Sanjay was talking about, it's going to have global repercussions, global impact. India is, I think, a global swing state, for example, on whether or not we allow China to essentially control the backbone of the Internet of Things, 5G. There are big decisions there for India. In conclusion, in the book that I referred to, I set out 5 principles of, I guess, competitive coexistence for this new era. I guess a slight inversion of the old 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. And I think they all apply to India in the challenge India has ahead. The first of those principles is deterrence, and we're seeing, I think, India getting very serious on that front. The second is diplomacy, and that, of course, is the intelligent use of diplomacy, not only bilaterally with China to tell them where you stand, but to work with partners particularly in the democratic world. The third principle is development. That is not only continuing India's journey of internal strengthening and internal development, but working with partners like Japan, Australia, the Europeans, the Americans, on building alternative infrastructure in the region so that China can't use its Belt and Road for strategic leverage. And the final two principles, which don't need much elaboration at the moment, are solidarity, but also finally resilience, which India is very good at. And I think, as again has been said by other speakers here, India has demonstrated in its history that its people are willing to go through difficulty, to make sacrifices for the national interest over the long term. And I suspect that's what we're going to see in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory. Thank you for your insights. And I couldn't help but mention that, the global pushback to technology the world over has got China worried, and there is a scope over here for the Quad to interact, and they can also share intelligence and also, emerging technologies. If they can be a platform, let the Quad be a platform where they can share information on emerging technologies. I think it's a very reasonable and a forward-looking recommendation from Rory. As far as the Australian Prime Minister is concerned, just to strengthen and bolster Australia's defense capabilities in the next decade, I think he's got there's an $70 billion that he has planned over the next decade. And both Australia and the US have banned ZTE and Huawei for the 5G contract bidding. So these are signs, and you mentioned also that the UK has done that recently. So there is some sort of a technological pushback from the countries after what China has done in the recent past. And I'm sure the actions at Galwan would not have endeared them to many people, many countries. So not that we take comfort in that, but the point is we have to really take a call, and we need to, call a spade and move forward. And this is the time, some ambassadors of India, former ambassadors have talked that this is the election point, and we have to think of moving forward and let the past baggage be left behind. I will now hand you over to Air Vice Marshal Bahadur, who is the ADG of Center for Air Power Studies. He will conduct the question and answer session since he's been collating all the questions. And we'll take a bag of about 3 to 4 questions, and I'll request the panelists if they can answer the questions. But try and keep your questions brief, keep your answers crisp and to the point. Okay, Manmohan, all to you. Over to you.
Thank you, sir. First of all, it's so good to have a whole lot of Air Force stations. Just for the information of everybody, we have out of 7 commands, 6 of the Indian Air Force commands and various Air Force stations are part of this seminar and are listening in and watching. And it's so heartening to find questions coming in from them. So what I'll do, sir, and the panelists, I'll pose a question each for each of the panelists. That means we'll have 4 questions, and then I'll come with the next 4. Pardon me if I don't take everybody's name. Basically, I've tried to get the subjects together so that all the questions get answered. For Dr. Baru, China, this is from Carl Jason from CAPS. China making India spend beyond its capability like the US did to USSR in matters of defense. Could China be doing this? Your views on the problem? And one more to Dr. Baru. How can Indian manufacturers, this is from Air Vice Marshal Gaur, how can Indian manufacturers increase API production? What can the government do? Because it is not too technologically advanced situation. For Mr. Ranade, from Group Captain Chaudhary, China does not respect India's sovereignty, as we have seen recently. Why can't we de-recognize Tibet as part of China? And two questions put by two officers, Group Captain Chordia and Pathak. Would it be appropriate for India to sort of muddle into Tibet, motivate and instigate, shall we say, the Tibetans or the locals, in case things go haywire in the next few days or few months? Mr. Sajanhar, also for Mr. Ranade, India has been timid reaching out to Tibet and Dalai Lama. How will China react if we interact at multiple levels? So that multiple levels encompasses, I suppose, the previous questions put by the two group captains. What backlash can we expect? That is from Mr. Sajanar to Mr. Ranade. To Sana from Dr. Manpreet Sethi. How is Taiwan looking at the present problem between India and China? And what is the local Taiwanese view of Indian reactions with the present ongoings with China? For Professor Medcalf, this is from Visa, India's wishy-washy position vis-a-vis Australia taking part in the Malabar series of exercises. We know that India has been an opponent till now as such, but the recent reports say that possibly Australia is being requested to join in. So what is the Australian position? How does Australia see this, shall I say, not specific stand of India? May I request Dr. Baru to start, please?
Yeah, I'll be very brief and quick. There are a couple of other questions which I read on the screen, so I'll answer all of them at one go. First, in fact, I think Air Marshal had a question whether there's a turning point as far as trust is concerned in the India-China relationship. I do think so. I think there is a fundamental question of a break in trust, and it's going to be very, very difficult to restore trust back into the India-China relationship. So in that sense, I do think what has happened in the recent past is a disruption in the bilateral relationship. On the specific question of APIs, look, we were actually manufacturers of APIs. The fact is that private companies in India went up walked up the ladder into branded generics and branded products, and now into molecules, etc. So we were importing APIs because they were cheap. It's cheaper to import this, and our import dependence went down. We can certainly very quickly revive the domestic production. There's no need for too many incentives if the government says this is a priority area. In fact, there is IDPL itself can become a major public sector manufacturer. So I don't think it's difficult. Just take time. We were neglecting it in the last decade or so. We can revive that industry. On the question of 5G ban, I think we should move forward. The question was, why is government delaying it? I have no idea. I'm not in the government. I have no idea why they're delaying it. Maybe they're waiting to see if there's any likelihood of change in Chinese behavior. But I do think 5G is a much larger issue, and we should take a very clear position very quickly. On the question of whether China is forcing India to increase defense spending, the fact is that we are not spending what we should. I mean, forget about what China is trying to do. We need to spend more. But in order to be able to spend more, we need to have a much stronger economy, a much robust fiscal situation. The government right now, in the last 2 years, is facing a major fiscal crisis. And right now, because of COVID and the lockdown, that fiscal crisis has become worse. So there are major internal economic and fiscal pressures which are preventing India from manufacturing more. I have lots of views on this, but this discussion is not about India's defense policy. I do think we should encourage more FDI, 100% and FDI, get in more companies which are exporting to India to actually manufacture, localized manufacturing here. Incidentally, the Soviet Union did not implode because the US forced the Soviet Union to spend more on defense. The Soviet Union imploded simply because it was an inefficient economy. And that's the lesson for us. The Chinese are where they are because they have built a very efficient economy. They have benefited from economies of scale, from high labor productivity, capital productivity, and that's the route for us to go to become a more efficient, globally competitive economy. Finally, there's this question on Iran, the Iranian sanctions. The fact is, the India-Iran relationship is a very complex relationship. I don't think we should look at this relationship either through the Pakistan prism or through the China prism. It has to stand on its own. The fact is the United States has exerted pressure on us for a variety of reasons. And right now, US influence on India is much more because of China. In fact, I jokingly have been asking people to educate me, why is it that China is pushing India into American hands and America is pushing Iran into the Chinese hands? This geopolitics of what is happening in this part of the world, I am not able to figure out, because Chinese actions have clearly made it necessary for India to forge a stronger relationship with the United States, which is not in China's interest. And US actions have forced Iran to move closer to China, which again not in US interest. So these big players are pursuing policies which I don't understand. But very quickly, those are my brief answers. I'll stop here.
Unmute yourself.
Yeah, okay. So,
Mr. Ranade, please.
Right. So there were a couple of questions for me, and let me respond to them. The first was about, in view of what is happening, about our taking a more active role in training the Tibetans, including militarily. Here, let me just say that we already have Tibetans in our armed forces. They are working with us. And further policies as to what to do and how to, shall I say, optimize this particular resource did start being discussed a few months ago. In fact, in the last month or month and a half of General Rawat being the army chief. I won't go into those details, but I'll just mention that here. But when I spoke about broadcasts, what we in intelligence profession call black broadcasts, they themselves will instigate and arouse the sentiments of Tibetans inside China. There are 7 million of them at last count. And also the ethnic Tibetans who reside in the border between Nepal and Tibet. They incidentally are a sizable group and they owe loyalty to the Dalai Lama. So there will be a lot of impact of these broadcasts. And on the Chinese also, we can already see how the word I would use is scared. The Chinese are of action by the Uyghurs. And you can imagine 7 million discontented Tibetans will really cause them a lot of worry and destabilize the situation. The second was a question about having multiple level contacts with the Tibetans here and what can we expect from the Chinese, what can be the backlash? Well, my short answer would be, what worse can the Chinese do? They have already put us under pressure. What we need to do is start looking after our own interests, certainly having multi-level contacts with the Tibetans here. Dalai Lama is present here, and I don't see why we need to keep him pushed away, hidden in a corner. He should share public platforms with our people, may not be with the president, but certainly with the others. And we should have more contacts at all levels, in fact, with the Tibetan groups here. I don't think the Chinese can do very much about that. The other was, I think, about Arunachal Pradesh and connectivity. And whether that is something that is feasible or even desirable. I would strongly recommend, and it is something that the government is already working on expanding and adding to the links, transportation links between Arunachal Pradesh and the rest of the country. So the first focus has been on air links because those are the easiest. constructing an airfield and getting air linkages going, cargo as well as passenger. The second is the railway. They're already working on it. I suppose it will take time, and the road links that exist. So I think they're already going on, and that's something that the government is already working on. They're thinking of it. The other is about Nepal. That's a problem which certainly the Chinese have instigated. They've used Oli, who is a pawn of theirs. We have been seeing over the last few years increasing activity by the Chinese inside Kathmandu, the Chinese embassy, as well as by the Chinese authorities. So, but it is something that we can turn around. I think the dependence of the Nepalese on India is something we should not ignore. They get married here, they buy property here, they have jobs here. There are almost 6 million of them who are employed here, who are contributing to the Nepalese exchequer in various ways through remittances. So that's a huge lever that we have. And what we need to do is build up lower levels of contacts in Nepal's political establishments across all parties, which I think is a failing that we have not done. I think that covers all the questions except de-recognize Tibet. That is something that is difficult to do, but we can certainly start making things difficult for the Chinese by insisting on reciprocity, which is the point I had made, that if we cannot travel or our people cannot travel to China or to other places, we can impose restrictions on them, and we can open up passages for Tibetans to travel to India. We can open up, and all Tibetans, regardless of where they are residing, by different routes, and that in itself will help renew their linkages not only with their Tibetan roots here, with the Dalai Lama and the heads of all the Tibetan sects, but also in India. So I think these are all doable options. De-recognition formally may not be possible, but these are ways to undermine Tibet, China's hold on Tibet. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sana, over to you.
Yeah, about that question on Taiwan's response to the recent standoff. So I'm going to divide Taiwan's response in three categories. The first is media. So what we have seen recently, the media, even Taiwanese media is reporting a lot on the recent standoff. And in fact, the media at least is very positive about India taking a proactive stance towards Taiwan. And I don't know if you have seen, and many of us are on Twitter. So there was a trend, Milk-Tea Alliance, which was trending on Twitter. So I think media is very positive and proactive about India. And also, second responses from the local population. So because media is reporting a lot on India, people are getting aware about what is happening between India and China. But I would still say that even though they're aware about what is happening, there's lack of exposure to Indian culture, people, and to India as a country as a whole. So I believe that this needs to be changed, and they're more concerned about, of course, cross-strait ties and their relationship with the US. So India, when you talk about locals generally do not talk about India much. And the third response is at the official level. They're kind of confused about how to reach out to India. They have tried to reach out to India, and they are kind of frustrated with India's response. But I believe that India is also kind of testing the water, because if you look at the recent appointment of the current Director General of India Taipei Association, which is our quasi embassy in Taipei, so he's Ambassador Gaurang Galal. He's one of the significant diplomats of his generation, and he's also supposedly close to the foreign minister. And also, we just have close to 1,000 foreign officers. And if we are sending someone like him to Taiwan, it actually means that India is thinking of advancing ties with Taiwan. It's just not sure how to go about it, but at least it's figuring out for India. And also another question, there was this question by Shalini ma'am. Is Taiwan worried about the cost it might have to pay for its relationship with Taiwan? India. China has been trying to shrink Taiwan's international diplomatic space. We know that Taiwan is just left with 15 diplomatic allies, and Taiwan has been spending a lot to keep these diplomatic allies intact. The one major reason for the transformation from Go South policy to the New Southbound policy was that they wanted to expand the areas of cooperation, also the areas of operation. It was just Southeast Asia and Japan, South Korea, and they wanted to reduce dependence on China. That Go South policy was introduced. But for New Southbound policy, they wanted to have good ties with countries in the South Asian region, and they know that they can't really enter South Asian region without India's cooperation. So I think it's a welcome step if India goes ahead and cooperates with Taiwan. So I don't think they're actually worried about India taking a positive step towards Taiwan. I think they are actually waiting for India to take that one step towards Taiwan.
Thank you, Sana. Professor Medcalf, I just posed one question, and in between the two more have come. Can Quad be upgraded to a military alliance? Is one from Group Captain Chaudhary. Air Vice Marshal Sabarwal asks, could India be invited to join Five Eyes to fill the void in Asia? And Mr. Sajan also asked, as the second question was, can ASEAN countries, after Secretary Pompeo's statement, become a little more aggressive in their dealings with China? All yours, sir.
Okay, there's a lot there, and I know we're up against time, so I'll be very quick. Look, I'll start with Malabar. I think, and a lot of these have a similar answer in a way. Look, I don't think that my friends in the Australian government have been obsessive about the Malabar issue. We've obviously been disappointed that it's taken a long time for India to invite Australia back formally into the Malabar naval maritime exercise process. But that doesn't matter so much, because one of the beauties of the quadrilateral dialogue is that it gives a kind of an umbrella for all sorts of really important things to happen below the Quad. So the trilaterals, the bilaterals, the Australia-India bilateral naval exercises now are high-end, high-trust, anti-submarine warfare, serious stuff. I think we want to be back in Malabar. I think we're fairly confident that in time we will, and hopefully that will be soon. But I don't think there's any real grudge there. And I think, we know there's history in our bilateral relationship, but that's all very old now. We've got convergent interests and a shared China challenge. On the other issues of, I guess, Five Eyes, Quad, military alliance, ASEAN and so forth, I'd encapsulate all that by saying that what we're trying to build here is a multi-layered architecture that can constrain Chinese power, that can oblige China to find a settling point that does not affront our interests and our values. And that's going to be a constant dynamic game. It's not going to be a simple rerun of the Cold War. There are not going to be very, very firm alliance blocks, I don't think. I think that in many ways you will have the United States and its treaty allies at one point, you'll have China at another, but you'll have very substantial middle powers who matter, and middle players, more than middle powers, who matter a lot more than they used to in really determining outcomes. And India will be crucial among that. So I think we don't need to go so far as to see the Quad as a formal NATO-like alliance. China, through its own very actions, is going to bring us closer together. And I think the ways it will bring us closer together are in areas like intelligence sharing, areas like technology cooperation. It doesn't mean that we're always going to be at the front lines for one another. It's still difficult to see Japan or Australia or even America fighting the fight at the front line with India. We don't need to. India can do that, but we can find ways of supporting India. And conversely, India may be able to do the same thing. And I think a question for us all is how, for example, do we support Taiwan as it really, I think, gets through a very, very difficult stage in relation to India. Lastly, on ASEAN, again, I think we want to see ASEAN step up, but I think we should be realistic about that and look at individual ASEAN states that can protect their interests and thus make a big difference as partners for us. And I would say Vietnam and Indonesia are both going to be the key states there. Vietnam's already doing it. I think Indonesia probably will be next. Just imagine if, for example, Indonesia had an experience not unlike Galwan, but at sea. And that's actually not an unrealistic possibility with China into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. But there's one question which possibly I can pose for all four. If there was one vulnerability, maybe two, that China has, that India can exploit without seeking some other.
Bahadur, your voice is cutting out. So if I request the panelists if they can answer this by, just about 1 minute each. We'll start with Dr. Sanjay Baru. If you've got the question, what are the vulnerabilities that we can exploit? That's it.
One vulnerability or two.
Just unmute yourself.
I will only focus on the economic vulnerability. And the one economic vulnerability that China has still is its dependence on the external markets. It has maintained an export-led economic model, though in the last few years it is trying to reduce its export dependence. And therefore, the kind of boycott that we have promoted, if we can get global traction, particularly in the technology field, that will be an important vulnerability.
Okay, Mr. Ranade.
Let me identify 3 points of vulnerability that the Chinese have and which we can exploit. The first is, of course, Tibet, but added to that is Xinjiang. There is a lot of restiveness in Xinjiang and in Tibet. As far as Tibetans are concerned, we have an advantage. As far as the Uyghurs are concerned, we have a channel through which we can exploit it and maybe cooperate with others. So I think that's one, and that accounts for half of China in any case. The second is that we need to rapidly develop, and I stress rapidly, the Andaman and Nicobar as a base. It is the choke point for China. We need to equip it with aircraft which have underground shelters. We need missiles there, and we need ships there, warships there. I think once that is done, we will have an effective chokehold over China. And that is something that I don't think, personally, I don't think we have more than a year. So please record that if it's there. The third is, of course, the size of our market, which Sanjay spoke about. That in itself is a lever. And I think the more we squeeze China's space in this market, the better it will be for us.
Sana, if there's something vis-a-vis Taiwan, how can we use?
Yeah, I believe that we have already accepted Tibet and Xinjiang as part of China, but we have been very ambiguous when it comes to Taiwan. Of course, we say we adhere to one China policy, but if you look at the joint statement language also, before we were accepting one China policy in joint statement, but we never talked about Taiwan being an inalienable part of China, even in the joint statement, like other countries, like Central Asian countries and even Russia. In their joint statement, they say that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China. So in fact, Taiwan is, we know, and Taiwan is the written core interest for China. So in fact, why China has gone and resolved the boundary dispute with Central Asia and Russia in the 1990s, one of the major reasons was that it didn't want these countries to go towards Taiwan, to establish diplomatic ties with Taiwan. So I believe that it's time, not because we are having a border standoff with China, but I think I've been saying this for the past few years, that it's time we look towards Taiwan, and it doesn't need to be through China angle. And as I've said, that we can't really go and establish defense ties with Taiwan in a go, but we can start with establishing robust economic ties with Taiwan, and people-to-people exchanges need to be there. So I believe these are the two things which we really need to focus on when we think about advancing ties with Taiwan.
Professor Medcalf, you have the last word.
Thank you. Look, I would emphasize 2 points. One is very much that idea of solidarity, and that is that China is allergic to anything that looks like coalition building against it. That's why it was so allergic to the Quad. But there is too much solidarity for China to whack all of the moles at once. We need to keep really taking the initiative on this. India, with all of these diverse partners that we're talking about here. And I think that will help in areas like, for example, a shared maritime surveillance picture, so that India isn't going to be bankrupted by increased defence spending, because we're all sharing the burden. The second point is really to do with, I guess, democracy and our own resilience, our own models of government. And that is, democracy is messy, but it works. It's difficult, but it works. We need to keep being proud of our own systems, our own models, and demonstrating that they work. After all, Taiwan demonstrates that democracy can work in China too. If we do those two things and we're patient, then I think we can really win this long game. Because if you look at economic projections 20 years from now, 20 years from now, it's only a matter of time before, if you like, China passes its peak, and the future belongs at least as much to India and other countries like Indonesia as it does to China.
Okay, thank you very much for all those very cryptic and very, very relevant points. And in summing up this particular seminar, Carl, may I have the screen, please? Yeah, if you can just put it on the full screen. Yeah. Now, finally, what this is essentially for the audience that we have in the blues, I would just like to sum up by saying that infrastructure development at airfields in the East, that is, if you see these particular slides, you'll notice that there's an additional dispersal that's coming up at Konka for up to 32 fighter aircraft to the south of number 27. And there are indications that hardened air shelters have also come up at some of the airfields in Tibet Autonomous Region. This just shows the bent of mind of the Chinese for a resolute military action in the future. And you heard what Mr. Jayadeva Ranade just mentioned about the timelines. So just keep this in mind. And while we continue to apply the leverages that have been so thoughtfully elaborated by the speakers today, we cannot but continue to keep our guard up. That's a given. I'll end with just one small thought, and that is for those of you who are boxers who've been in the ring, and I'm sure most of you in the blue have been done the novices at NDA. In boxing, we normally jab with the left, punch with the right. Have you ever wondered what the southpaw does? I'm relating this to the actions that took place at Galwan. So just think about it, and you'll probably get your answer that the punch might come in the future. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your wholehearted support. And I think we should end this by, if you can unmute your mics, I think we need to give a round of applause for the speakers. Also, I'd like to share a moment for the hard work that has been put in by the faculty at CAPS. Worked tirelessly behind the scenes to put this event together. I think they too deserve your appreciation. Thank you. And I think the final message is all of you, please stay safe, stay healthy, stay cheerful in these trying times, and we will take your lead till we meet again. Jai Hind.
So, thank you very much, Marshal.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marshal.
Thank you very much.
Everybody.
Thank you, Professor.